Oh, first edition of Every Cloud has a platinum lining. I got to address the Jim Cornette thing. Couple housekeeping things right off the bat. Instead of doing a whole separate video, I'm just going to own up to my mistakes that I've made lately right here. Intense Wrestling had 187 on an undercover cop, not 63, which was the American Legion post or whatever it was. I didn't read it close enough. In my MLW reports, Sharada Zenshi, not Gringo Loco, which I know means crazy white boy. So why would he be the crazy white boy? Anyway, that's just a fuck up by me. Shit happens. And Thatcher wasn't the guy with the steel horse thing. Yay! Now let's get into the Jim Cornette shit. What's my take? My initial take is I'm looking at responses online. And as usual, I hate them all. Hate them all. Yes, yours too. So I'm going to offer my own. But first I'm going to do an unboxing because I have a lot of these to go through, which is amazing. I'm wearing my current freaking favorite shirt, the You're Not on My P-List bitch shirt, which is amazing. I'm going to open this one up. We'll see who it's from. We'll see what it is. Pretty apropos, since this is about Jim Cornette. Ringmaster of the Shit Show. I think I know who sent this to me. Miss Diana Michelle. God bless you. God bless you in more ways than one. God did bless you. And anyway, sorry. Let's put this bad boy on. Right now, I am ringmaster of the shit show known as the Jim Cornette thing. So for those of you who don't know, and I would imagine if you watch this video, there's a 98% chance you do. So Jim Cornette made a joke describing one wrestler as so tough that he could put a bucket of fried chicken on his back and walk through a bunch of Ethiopians. It was deemed insensitive. This is on the heels, and this is all these things I'm going to bring up are all important factors in all of this, right? Jim Cornette has said a number of things lately that have been a little spurious, and Jim Cornette has always said things that sort of were spurious, crossed the line, almost crossed the line, made you wonder where the line was, and all of that. I'm going to tell a number of things that have happened in Jim Cornette's past as a way of addressing what I ultimately think about the whole thing. Yeah? Because context is important. It's also important to note when somebody's being a hypocrite or possibly being a hypocrite. I'm a big fan of Jim Cornette. Let me just put that out in the front. The things that he writes, I read. The shows that he has, I listen to and watch. I think he's great, and he's gone to PCW shows before, etc., etc., etc. Talked to him on a couple of occasions. All right, so that's some of my possible bias. So Ed Ferrara did an impersonation of Jim Ross in WCW, the Oklahoma gimmick. Hooray! Hooray! All that stuff, right? So Jim Cornette didn't like it. It offended Jim Cornette. It was a bit that a lot of people, and keep in mind that this was like 20 years ago, right? Literally 20 years ago. And people were offended about it. But they were offended because they liked Jim Ross. Let's make that clear. For the most part, wrestling had always done archetypes and stereotypes and all kinds of things. A number of people have pointed out, like, oh my God, the comments that Bobby Heenan used to make and Jesse Ventura used to make and all this stuff in wrestling. And all that's completely true. Right? But here's the story. So Ed Ferrara at one point was going to record something for TNA in the same building where Jim Cornette was going to be working for somebody else. And so the person who had hired Jim Cornette was like, please don't. I know you'd always said you were going to do something to Ed Ferrara. You were going to hit him if you ever saw him. You were going to punch his lights out and all this kind of bodily threatening stuff that Jim Cornette threw around like it was nothing. Just problematic, by the way. But it's wrestling, it's whatever. So Jim Cornette had always, and so he promised his friend, because he didn't want his friend to get into trouble because he did things with TNA as well. So he said, I won't hit him. So he sees Ed Ferrara. And what does Ed Ferrara do to provoke him? He sticks his hand out and he smiles and he said, Jim, I hope we can let bygones be bygones. He was attempting to squash it. And Jim Cornette said, fuck you. Meet me outside to fight me, you fucking gutless coward. And in this professional setting where they're all working, Jim Cornette fucking goes crazy and says, come outside and fight me, you fuck, because you made fun of my good friend Jim Ross and ostensibly offended Jim Cornette. And it was worth fighting over. Even though he said he wouldn't hit the guy, now he's asking for him to go outside so he can fight him. Ed Ferrara turns it down, so Jim Cornette spits on him. Okay. My initial take when I heard about this whole thing, and then somebody in one of my chat groups immediately got the clip so I could freaking hear it and hear it in context, which I greatly appreciate, is that it made me think of this. And this is another side note, but I think it's noteworthy and interesting because it's something about pro wrestling. The joke itself, I was less offended than I was just horrified that Jim Cornette, I mean, that reference is like 30 years old, and a number of people have pointed that out as a defense, right? Oh, it's a joke. It's just this throwaway joke we've used variations of for like 30 years. Try 40, first of all. And here's a side note. This notion, oh God, this is going to get me in more trouble than my take on woke culture and pro wrestling and Jim Cornette and all the rest of it. We hold this reverence for old timers and how witty they are. They've fucking never been witty. Not really. We give them way too much credit. Jerry Lawler, Bobby Heenan, Jim Cornette. We give them too much credit. They've been doing fucking vaudeville jokes. Vaudeville jokes. Folks, variations of the 1001 Insult book that I read when I was a kid. The same tired jokes of it takes you an hour to make minute rice. I've been listening to that shit my whole life from quote unquote brilliant wrestling people. Their material fucking blows. And it's always kind of blown. But their delivery is so great. And the fact that they were audacious enough to say it was interesting. But we act like we're protecting some kind of incredible art form with the things that these guys say that are tired and played out and lame as fuck. That's a side note. I'll just rattle through it. What Cornette said. Is it a fireable offense, in my opinion? No. Is it a lame joke? Fucking yeah. Was there a more clever or interesting way to get that across? Absolutely. Why are we... These old guys in wrestling, who a lot of people are very quick to defend, it's like they're institutional and they're a great part. Why can't they fucking adapt? Because you know what? The great performers in other entertainment media adapted. Yes, they did. Yeah. And do you think Betty White currently, who is beloved, is doing the same shit she was doing 40, 50, 60 years ago? No. You find ways to keep it new and fucking fresh. Why in pro wrestling does The only way we think that we're honoring or doing really pro wrestling is to do it like it was 40 years ago exactly. Including, can you convey that the wrestler that he's talking about is tough without having to go to some fucking throwaway lame line? Yeah. Is it a fireable offense? In my opinion, no. Is it a lame joke? Yes. Is it tone deaf? Absolutely, especially for a guy who advocates a lot of woke culture. That's another interesting point, is it not? Is Jim Cornette a hypocrite? So the Oklahoma bit, which I'll just put out there, I thought it was fucking hilarious. For Jim Cornette to threaten bodily injury and fucking constantly yell that he's gonna shoot this guy or this guy should fucking die over fucking wrestling shit. It's anachronistic and it's fucking lame. And you can say it, as many people have, Jim Cornette's gonna gym, Jim's gonna gym, and that's absolutely true. But how often do both sides, when somebody gets in trouble, love to say, depending on who it is getting in trouble, freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequences. And the NWA wasn't responding to a groundswell of you got to get rid of Jim Cornette. They were heading things off at the pass, which is what companies tend to do nowadays. And frankly, they were probably secretly a little tired of Jim's shit. And the fact that Jim Cornette, in spite of the fact that the NWA would seem to be exactly the product, and I've pointed this out before, exactly the kind of product that he should have been rallying behind, he didn't seem to really give a shit. And he really seems to be at this point in his career, and this is not a knock on his hustle, this is just the truth as I see it. Jim Cornette's just doing money gigs, and he's really happiest just sitting there, quote unquote, being himself. Anybody who listens to his show and the things that he says on podcasts and stuff like that, Jim Cornette cannot go 10 minutes without talking about how happy he is just kind of being himself. So cool. But the NWA, what they're weighing the risk reward. What's the reward of keeping Jim Cornette? Obviously not worth the risk that he's going to fuck them over, because Jim Cornette, with his words and deeds behind the scenes and in front of a camera, has fucked over almost every group that he's worked for in the last 15 to 20 years. That is a fact. Ring of Honor, when he was one of the guys who was instrumental in helping them get the Sinclair deal, also did a number of things that fucked them over. And his relationship with other employees. You know, we say this about people all the time, right? Like if you have somebody who's had a number of relationships, romantic relationships, that all went fucking horribly south, at some point, maybe it's not everybody else, maybe it's you. At what point do we go, maybe it's not everybody else, maybe it's Jim. Maybe he should own up to some of it, but he never will, which some people will take as a sign of strength and others will see as a sign of weakness. Which one do you think it is? I tend to think it's a little of both. Like I said, I admire Jim Cornette. I'm going to tend to give him the benefit of the doubt on everything. You know, he would defend, I think, the spitting on Ed Ferrara. Again, think of how fucking shitty that is. That whole context of that story, right? That it was personal. It was personal, right? This is Jim Ross is my friend, and Jim Ross has done so much for this business. First of all, whatever Jim Ross has done for the business and blah, 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 that's irrelevant to the, it just came down to it felt personal. And all the people who are railing about like, it's just a fucking joke and blah, 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 blah. Fried chicken and da-da-da. It doesn't mean anything to me. Of course, older white dudes. Of course. It doesn't mean anything to you. If Jim Cornette would defend his actions with Ed Ferrara, which were actual and physical, right? Spit on a guy, threatened a guy, said publicly what he was going to do to that guy, broke a promise to a friend essentially that I'm not going to fuck your thing up with TNA by doing something crazy, but I'm not going to hit him. But then went with this technicality of, well, I didn't hit him. I just challenged him to a fight outside and then I fucking spit on him in this place where we're all trying to do business. I mean, it's fucking craziness. It's fucking terrible. And it's basically going back on his word. At the end of the day, I will say that Jim Cornette's comment and his conduct in a lot of matters lately is at best cringy as fuck. Are there people who were genuinely offended by the comment? Probably. But it's not the comment itself and who's the target of it and who's the potential target of it. It's just that the general atmosphere of pro wrestling has always been 30 to 40 years behind the rest of society. And in some ways that's great. You can still do archetypes bordering on stereotypes in a way that you couldn't do in other art forms in a public media. It's one of the things I love about pro wrestling. I will put that out there, that I could create a character like Dwight Power and just go hard. Dwight Power! Dwight Power! But at the end of the day, Dwight Power is going to lose and get his ass kicked, right? I could play with this idea of fucking stereotype and push it to such an nth degree that we could tell very fascinating, nuanced stories with something that seemed very, very stereotypical and simple. That's interesting to me. Right? Like the Concrete Gorillas, which was not my creation by any stretch, but I certainly booked them in such a way with the conflicts and the promos and different things like that. We created magic. And a lot of that magic was created by being dangerous and walking the line and sometimes going too far and having to forcibly pull it back and risking backlash. Again, keep in mind, I did my shows not in front of frickin' tiny southern audiences. I was doing mine with the fucking intelligentsia, the quote unquote elite theater patrons, right? And with them, I was even more excited to push the envelope, right? It's just like America being a puritanical culture gives rise to the porn and escort industry in a way that nowhere else in the world. Right? It's the fact that deep down they're prudes is in the soul of the country that allows the deviant stuff to run rampant and make money. So in pro wrestling, it's the more proper and politically correct, and the more that other things are at odds in the outside world, the more pro wrestling has always sort of thrived on that. But pro wrestling stopped thriving on it more than a decade ago. And anyone who doesn't recognize that, especially somebody who's as intimately involved in the professional wrestling business as Jim Cornette has been, is tone fucking deaf or deliberately belligerent. Either way, you're fucked. You gotta understand. You have to do better. Yeah. If you hate the fact that wrestling is seen as like lowbrow and the fans are dumb and anyone who gets involved in that fake shit is blah, 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 you can't have it both ways. The art of pro wrestling has to elevate. And there are people who bristle when they call it performance art and fuck calling it performance art and blah, 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 blah. But you can't have it both ways. And what I like, here's the platinum lining in this fucking cloud. Because it bothers me so much that Jim Cornette, that all this is happening. I imagine, though, he wasn't fired. I don't even think it was a like put your resignation letter on my desk thing. I think it was just him going like, you know what? I don't want to fucking deal with this. Fuck it. And I don't want to put my friends. That's how he's going to defend it. I have friends at the NWA, and I don't want to fuck them over just because I fucking feel like saying what I'm saying. But I'm going to attack fucking woke culture. No, 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 no. He's going to go on the offensive. He's going to retreat first and then go on the offensive. That's what Jim Cornette does. That's what most people do in response to this kind of thing. Here's the platinum lining. It's forcing a discussion that probably needed to happen for decades in pro wrestling. And recently stuff has come up about like Brad Cash sort of revealing, yeah, this one wrestler slash promoter said this thing about Nina Monet and it was way over the line and nobody backed me up. I had no idea what the fuck he was talking about, honestly. And I called to like, well, tell me what's up because I'm going to talk about it, and he still hasn't done it. But that's whatever. But there's probably discussions that needed to be had about sexism, about race stuff, about gay stuff. And Jacob Ashworth the Jacob Ashworth thing brought a lot of this up, right? So what's going to be the response from people? It's forcing a discussion, it's forcing a revaluation. And what I'm afraid is going to happen is some very good, very smart old white men are going to respond by just digging in their heels or crossing their arms. When I think there can be a discussion and there can be a social moray created, I do think it's possible. Because I walk that line all the time. Anybody will tell you my humor in a locker room is as edgy as anybody's has ever been. And a number of the things we did in PCW were as edgy and groundbreaking and dangerous as has ever been. And fortunately, I was smart enough to defend it. Fortunately, I included the wrestlers in what I was doing and why. Fortunately, I ran things by people, but still fuck ups happened. But I think people will allow it because I'm able to own up to mistakes. And I include them in the discussion. And I try to be empathetic in that discussion. But if you've already just dug in like a tick on whatever your side is, what can I say to you? Probably nothing that's going to move you. But that's not really my goal. This is about my take. I think wrestling has been due for a sea change for decades. And I will say Jim Cornette, unfortunately, in this whole thing, that he is collateral damage, that he is not the military target. He is not the thing that should be targeted. And I think when we see that whole t-shirt debacle in the WWE, again, I think it's just symptomatic of a problem. In and of itself, it is not the problem, but it is symptomatic of a deeper problem that has really never been addressed in wrestling. But something tells me they're going to be addressed now. When you look at the tired defenses and the tired offenses against Jim Cornette, he's pushed black wrestlers, so how could he be racist? And this is not me saying Jim Cornette is racist, but the defense of, but he's pushed black wrestlers. It's the Bill Watts defense, right? Which people have famously mocked, including of, well, but I pushed black champions before. I can't be racist. I'm more libertarian and I just feel like saying whatever I'm going to say. The age of Bill Watts is done decades ago. And I think Jim Cornette in a quiet moment will go, you know what? I don't really want to be associated with a thing like Bill Watts was, do I? I hope he doesn't. The platinum lining to this cloud can be wrestling can maybe pull itself into something modern without just false finishes and all the rest of it. The in-ring has changed. And it has changed in wrestling's DNA for good. You are not going to be able to do a match like you did in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. But it's going to require people, especially older people of a Caucasian persuasion, to learn, to listen in a way that they never had to before. And is it their fault that they never had to before? Not necessarily. But the times, they are changing. And this culture war that's going on in professional wrestling right now, it's a real thing. I, for one, am going to do my best to broker a peace. And I've always advocated for a change. My changes that I usually call for are more fundamental in wrestling, right? But I'm going to fight the urge to always cross my arms when somebody else is demanding that I think and consider that there may be a better way. It's interesting that we always tell new wrestlers and new people to the wrestling business, keep your mouth shut and your ears and eyes open. Does that sound familiar? Then why, when it comes to cultural shifts that wrestling should acknowledge for its own benefit and survival and thriving, potentially, why do people who are the least willing to change, who are the most prone to tell others, mouth shut, ears and eyes open, so unwilling to do it themselves when it comes to a cultural shift that they themselves are new to and don't entirely understand? Something to think about.